Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Today, our Mental Wellness Social is focused on video gaming disorders, and we'll get started in just a few minutes, but we do have a few slides to go over just to get us started. My name is Tiffany Thomas. I am the Program Manager of Education and Outreach at the Mental Health Association of Maryland. And I'm joined here today by Haley Riscala from Maryland Coalition of Families. And we are really excited to have Dr. Clifford Sussman here today to talk to us about video gaming disorders. If you are interested in learning more about him and the work that he does, you can take some time today to look at his website. I'm just dropping his website link in the chat. Lots of really great resources there for you. If you have any questions about any topics that you would like to see us cover in the future, or any questions about children's mental health at all, or the work that we do through the Children's Mental Health Matters campaign, you can reach out to myself or Haley. Our email address is here. There's lots of work that we're doing across the state. And of course, Children's Mental Health Matters Awareness Week is May 7th through the 13th this year. And we encourage you all to get involved as you are able in your schools, businesses, and communities. We also encourage you to follow us on social media as we share lots of resources, not just on video gaming disorder, but on all different mental health conditions and anything that children and families are facing with behavioral health and substance use conditions right now. So please follow us on social media. We would love to have you, and you can also sign up for our newsletter on our website. So just some gentle reminders before we get started. We ask that you keep your microphone muted, just in case you have any background noise. We will have a time at the end for questions, so you can unmute then. We are recording this presentation, so you will be able to view it later, and we'll send out that recording. The recording and a handout that Dr. Sussman has provided will be emailed to you. Slides will not be available from this presentation per the request of Dr. Sussman, but we do have the recording and resources. And there will not be breakout rooms today, as there was if you attended the first wellness social we had. We'll be doing one big group Q&A conversation time at the end. So if you have questions that come up during his presentation, I encourage you just to keep those in the back of your mind. You can drop them in the Q&A at the end, or we encourage you to come on camera and have a conversation with Dr. Sussman. You can do either, whatever you're comfortable with. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Sussman and let him get started with his presentation.
I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So my slides are showing now. All right. Okay, welcome everyone. So I'm going to talk about gaming disorder today and a little bit on my background. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I have a private practice. I've been in practice in DC since 2008, very close to Maryland. I specialize in internet and video game addiction. And I have a background myself in gaming. I have done I did a lot of game playing as growing up, but I also, and I'm still a gamer to this day, but I also did some game development. I worked for a while developing educational software as well, often in the form of games. And that was all before I went to medical school. So there's a lot of demand for help in this area now, in the wake of this pandemic. So I've done a lot of public speaking. definitely a lot more since the pandemic started. And I've written a bunch of articles on it, and I've got more coming out. But you can get a lot of the videos and articles and things like that I specifically geared towards parents on my website in the information section at cliffordsussmanmd.com. You can also find out more about media appearances I've had and a lot of other things. So there's even training for professionals on my website that they can link to. So I'm excited about it, and I hope you'll check it out. So let me talk a bit about, before I go into specifically gaming disorder and start taking your questions on it, let me give you sort of a overall view of why our kids are so into games in the first place, why it's so hard for them to get off of these games. This is I'm just going to show some screenshots from some games that your kids may be playing. For both younger and older kids, a popular one is Mario Kart. It's played on the Switch usually, a Nintendo Switch, and a console, and it's exhilarating and exciting, and you can play with people all over the world, or you can play with somebody sitting right next to you. And there's also a lot of different genres of video games that all give you different emotional experiences, such as there's horror games, there's all sorts of adventures you can go on. I was very into single player adventure games growing up because they were filled with puzzles. But the tendency in video games, as we'll talk about, is really towards multiplayer games. Nonetheless, aside from just having all these like exhilarating emotional experiences that can, alter your mood from what it is at the time you're playing, you can also sort of escape reality. You enter a virtual world when you're gaming, and like you see in the world on the left, the scene from World of Warcraft, you can become an avatar in the game, and the avatar can be an extension of you, it can be an expression of your identity, or it can be someone else completely. Your avatar can have traits that you may not have, but that you want to have. So your avatar can represent you and all, and can sometimes even compensate for any perceived shortcomings that people have of themselves. And you can see on the right that for some people, gaming is a completely immersive experience. These people have track shoes on that when they walk around, their avatar walks around. So you really are in a different world, in a virtual world. And I think that, and research shows too, that like one of the common motivations of gamers is to escape. And gaming provides an escape from the world you're in. And some kids just want to spend all their time in this virtual world because it's such an appealing escape. Now, another thing our kids get out of gaming is mastery, a sense of mastery. This is a really popular game, Minecraft, and you can see on the left what maybe somebody new to Minecraft might see when they're entering the world. It's a very heavily pixelated world. It's an open world. It's kind of like virtual Legos. You can build anything you want in Minecraft. You can kind of design your own game, so to speak, in addition to playing basic games that are on Minecraft. And perhaps the most popular thing to do on Minecraft is to go and play other people's games, to go into other people's servers and explore the worlds that they've made. And so you can see on the right the type of thing you can build in Minecraft if you have mastery of Minecraft. And there's really endless mastery. There's mastery of being able to create a world yourself, and there's also mastery of worlds that other people have created. So that's one way games have really evolved today, is that when I was playing those single player adventure games that I mentioned, you usually go through them once, you beat the game, you'd have mastered it, And that requires like a finite level of mastery. Whereas games today, because they're open world and because there's no top level, you can keep leveling up and leveling up. And because of things like Minecraft, there's just opportunities for endless mastery. So, you know, you're never really done in the virtual world of games. So I mentioned that gaming has shifted towards multiplayer in recent years. And, you know, certainly that was the most popular form and perhaps the most addictive form of game prior to the pandemic. But in a pandemic where everybody became socially isolated, it became almost like the entire social universe for a lot of kids. It became their only way to connect with other kids, and they could connect with kids, like I said, around the world. So massive multiplayer online games have a long list now. I mean, they're pretty much everything that's coming out today. Things like Fortnite, World of Warcraft, Rocket League, Overwatch, there's many others. I mean, Rocket League, it's a car kicking a ball into a goal. It's basically cars playing soccer. And I never really understood the appeal of that, but I have so many patients who just love that game. And I think it has a lot to do with just the multiplayer play aspect and, you know, competing with people all over. And so gaming has really become incredibly social. In fact, it's so much so that I really think it's becoming more and more silly that we talk about it as something different than social media, because it kind of is social media. And, you know, I think you could argue that social media itself is very addictive, even without the gaming aspects. So, you know, more examples of how people use gaming for their socializing. You know, this is on the left, you see a scene from a convention where people are dressed as their Fortnite characters and talking to each other. And while on the one hand, it's pretty awesome that they're socializing in the real world, they still take a little bit of the virtual world with them. In fact, I like to think about that guy in the tomato head mask because, you know, much like the masks during COVID that covered our faces, I mean, his face is entirely covered. And that means that, you know, I mean, this character can be himself to some extent, but he can also be the character he's playing. And so again, you know, as someone with a psychological background, I mean, that keeps making me think of people, you know, compensating or trying to, you know, present a different version of themselves. Not necessarily a version that's completely different from them, but you know, their character can certainly make up for any shortcomings that they perceive that they have. I work with a lot of patients who are, as you might imagine, who are in the spectrum, who have various degrees of autism, mostly high functioning autism in my practice, and you know, they struggle with reading facial cues and nonverbal cues. They struggle with all sorts of social communication. And what being able to talk to somebody in a costume does, just like being able to go on Discord and talk to other gamers about gaming. Discord, I have a picture of it on the right. That's a social media application for gaming, for gamers. It's kind of like a combination of Snapchat and Facebook and a bunch of other social media apps all in one, and especially for gamers to keep in touch with each other and figure out which games each other are playing on. And I have to say, during the pandemic, a lot of the patients I had a screen up next to their class screen that had Discord open. So they were kind of going back and forth. Discord is very popular right now, but where I was going with the autism comment is I was going to say that, you know, all of these things kind of level the social playing field. So, you know, the positive is that now somebody who's in the spectrum can feel more socially connected and maybe less lonely and isolated. But the downside is that, you know, they may not be learning all the social skills they really need if they stay in that virtual space. You know, it's so it may be a replacement social life, so to speak, but it's not a substitute for the one you have in the real world. There's a lot of ways they're different. Another version of a online multiplayer game that's super popular, this is the game Roblox, and similar to Minecraft, it's like lots of user generated games, lots of user created games. So instead of people just playing games by game developers, people are now playing games made by each other. And so again, that it creates endless mastery and an endless amount of games for kids to play. An endless amount of offering people. So it's getting more and more so that kids can get like whatever they want, whenever they want it online. There's another really popular one to be aware of called Genshin Impact. It's a lot like the Nintendo Switch game Zelda Breath of the Wild, but it's an online free-to-play game, which really just means that, you know, downloading the game and playing it is free, but the game makers make a fortune on people purchasing things like loot boxes and upgrades online. And so the concept of loot boxes brings us to the another real unconscious appeal of gaming among our kids. But the game developers are well aware of this, and that's called variable ratio reinforcement. It's an important psychological concept for anyone who wants to understand gambling. It's basically what variable ratio reinforcement is, and it came from a lot of psychological studies by people like B.S. Skinner with mice, is that it's the way that our brains are really attracted to random choice, and we're really attracted to not being able to predict what's going to happen next, you know, variability of outcome. So in variable ratio reinforcement, what it means is that you're getting a reward that's different every time or that's unpredictable, right? So instead of getting the same thing every time, you're getting lots of different things. You know, the classic example is that there was these mice who would pull these levers in the old psychological experiments, and they get a pellet of food each time. And, you know, they would learn that when they press the lever, they get the food pellet. And when you stop giving them the food, they quickly learn not to press the lever anymore. But if you gave the mice the food at random intervals, which was called variable ratio reinforcement, so sometimes they get the pellet, sometimes they wouldn't, and they couldn't predict how many presses it would take, the mice were all of a sudden pushing the lever like your kids playing video games. I mean, or like somebody pulling the lever of a slot machine. They were just over and over again, and they couldn't stop. And they were going for long after they stopped giving them food. So it was so scientists learned that, you know, giving people reward in a variable ratio delivery way was, you know, led to a lot more behavior, a lot more compulsive and addictive like behavior. And that's why you have games like Candy Crush are designed to, and that's what I have in this picture, which has been around a while. You know, it's designed to have levels and levels and layers and layers and layers of variable ratio reinforcement all baked in on top of each other. And that's why it's so hard to stop playing a game like that. Because, you know, it's always giving you, for example, a random assortment of candies on the screen. And when you move the candies around, you'll start these chain reactions of all sorts of explosions and events. And those can last a long time or a very short time. And then and they can give you a lot of points or very few points. But then, you know, even when you get a lot of points and have a very long chain of events, you'll get additional variable ratio reinforcement. For example, this voice that comes out and this big message that pops up on your screen that says sweet, you know, so it's giving you this praise, but even the praise is variable ratio reinforcement, because sometimes it'll say delicious, and sometimes, you know, it'll have like 10 different other little praises, but sometimes it'll have no praise at all, even after the most incredible things. So everything online is really in this, has sort of figured this out and sort of follows this spirit of variable ratio reinforcement. Even a lot of the apps that you're all probably using on social media. So let me summarize the characteristics of games that I've just reviewed, and that make it so addictive. And let me point out that these characteristics are also found in things like cocaine use and gambling. So we talked about the mood changes from gaming, the sense of mastery, escape from reality, a social aid, variable ratio reinforcement. These are all nothing new, like, to our brain. And then I left out the most important thing that we get out of playing games, and that we get out of virtually anything that's online, any form of online entertainment, at least, which, in other words, you need this for anything to be addictive, and that is immediate gratification. The most basic understanding of addiction that's based on, like, the most established literature will tell you that, that what produces dopamine, which is the brain neurotransmitter that gets us to seek reward, that it's a great influence on our behavior. This dopamine is produced mostly in response to immediate gratification. In other words, we need to get what we want when we want it, and that's when we release dopamine. If you have to wait for something, if it takes a lot of patience, there's not as much dopamine, and it's not just about how high something gets us or how often we do it. A lot of it is just about how quickly we get whatever it is we're getting from that thing, which is why cigarettes are so addictive, even though they don't get you as high as some of the other drugs that are addictive, because what they do get you, they get you right away because you're smoking them and they enter your bloodstream fast. So bottom line takeaway point from this is that kids don't like to wait. Teenagers don't like to wait. We all don't like to wait, but teenagers and kids more than anyone else. And the reason for that is that the reason that kids are so dependent on immediate gratification is that they're driven by dopamine much more than older people. So if you think of the brain, we kind of have a driver system in the brain and a braking system in the brain. You can think of dopamine as what drives us. So it's released from this part of the brain where you see the green arrow, kind of in the centers of our brain. And the dopamine goes along these blue pathways throughout our brain, right? And that gets us to seek things. It gets us to go after things. It gets us to, again, try to get what we want when we want it, right? But we have another system in our brain that's kind of like a braking system, so if you keep going with the car analogy, and that's the prefrontal cortex. So if you see these red arrows, they're sort of the braking system that's opposing this green arrow. So that, in other words, when kids are like gaming for a long time and they want to stop, they have to put on the brakes, and to do that, they need their prefrontal cortex. So I might come back to this in a minute, but the reason that this is so important with teenagers and kids is because kids and teenagers have a much more poorly developed prefrontal cortex. Teenagers have the most developed dopamine system, and it's in contrast to a very weak braking system that gets better and better as we advance to our late 20s and early 30s. And because of that, they're most vulnerable to addiction and not being able to use their brakes. Okay, so if you zoom in on these blue pathways, you're going to see chains of brain cells. And so I'm going to demonstrate what happens on a molecular level when kids are doing something over and over and can't use their brakes, when they just keep going and going and going, and it turns into binging. So if you think of the brain as like a bunch of wires that are carrying signals, and you think of each of those individual wires as a chain of brain cells, which is kind of what they are. If you zoom in on the brain cells themselves, you'll see that they're not just one continuous wire. They actually have little gaps in between the brain cells. So these little gaps are called synapses. And in order for a signal to get down our brain, it has to jump from one brain cell to the next brain cell. And so that's where dopamine comes in. Dopamine is released from one brain cell and goes into the next brain cell, always in one direction, just like an electric current. And so at baseline, we have these dopamine molecules, which I made into little Pikachus, and they're going into what's called receptors on the surface of the next cell and sending a signal down, down the pathway. And so even at baseline, your child's brain has dopamine crossing this little gap and sending a signal. But when they're getting what they want, when they want it, so let's say they're playing a video game, all of a sudden you're getting a lot more dopamine crossing the synapse. And so, you see our kids a lot happier now. He's stimulated. Then when he's played for hours and hours on end, what happens is there's a process called receptor downregulation. So all of a sudden there's fewer receptors on the surface of the next cell. So it's like the brain, has to maintain its energy. And so to do that, it actually gets rid of a lot of its receptors. And because of that, so it's basically you have still a lot of pleasure from the game, but you have fewer receptors for that pleasure. And so you're not receiving as much of that pleasure. So that's why this guy has been playing games for hours and hours and hours and maybe days and days and days, and he's not enjoying himself as much, right? So why is he staying on? It's because if he stops, all of a sudden he's not getting that dopamine anymore, but he still has fewer receptors. The receptors take much longer to come back. So while this is a reversible process, it takes a while, days, weeks, and in that time, our kid who's now not playing video games, he's been desensitized to pleasure because he has fewer receptors. So he doesn't feel pleasure as well, and he needs more stimulation as opposed to less, because if he gets less, like going to class the next day after a weekend binging on games, he's going to be irritated and miserable. And because he's actually getting less dopamine than he was before he started. Okay, so the bottom line is that digital binging has residual effects. It's not such a problem that kids are like trying to get a dopamine hit. We all are. It's that they don't stop. They don't put on the brakes. They binge and binge and binge. And when it's hours and hours on end, the residual effects are more boredom, and more simulation seeking, more reward seeking, which leads to more digital binging. So it's a vicious cycle. And if your kids get into too much of that vicious cycle, they can really start to develop problems in their life. And so kids in this state will take dopamine in any form. So it's not just games. They might, you might finally get them off to the computer and get them into bed, and then they're pulling out an iPhone next to their bed, which is showing them streaming videos of the game they were just playing with other kids playing it. So kids will hop from one form of dopamine to another. It's not just about gaming, it's about anything that gets them what they want when they want it. So why aren't we, why don't I tell kids that they should just be abstinent from video games or abstinent from this sort of these sources of a lot of dopamine, what I would call high dopamine activities? Well, I think it's unrealistic. We're really functionally dependent on tech. First of all, our kids actually need to be good at using computers, and they're always surrounded by them. And also, if you learn to balance your high and low dopamine activities, and I'll go into that more in a second, you're learning two important skills that will help you with life. One is delayed gratification, and the other is using those breaks. And so kids really have to train those two skills, and they're not going to get that with abstinence. It's actually important for them to be able to do something for just a while and then stop. So I don't teach parents that they have to make their kids more productive and get them to balance work and play better. I teach them that they have to, I teach them a very brain model based version of balance, where they're balancing high dopamine activity and low dopamine activity, which doesn't necessarily have to be productive. And I define healthy use as balancing the two. So high dopamine activities are things like video games, social media, web surfing, drugs and alcohol, gambling. Low dopamine activities are things like using a word processor. You see, so you can even do them on a screen, using PowerPoint or Photoshop, doing coding, even maybe having a video chat with their friends may be more low dopamine. So by low dopamine, what I mean is that these activities take more patience. They have more delayed gratification. And of course, we really want to direct our kids towards off-screen low dopamine activities, because the problem with doing all on-screen low dopamine activities is that, it's like drinking water in a bar. You're getting the cues from your screen that are telling you, hey, it's time to play a game. You have all these digital distractions. So off-screen low dopamine activities are a major part of what I try to get kids to shift towards. Arts and crafts, board games, books, cleaning, dancing, drawing, photography, puzzles, music. Even being bored is a low dopamine activity. So the point is that all these things take a lot more patience than playing a video game. Of course, it's a scale. I mean, not all of these things are as low dopamine as others, but they all can be a low dopamine alternative when you contrast them with video games. It's very difficult to parent these things and to parent this balance. And I think if you have a teenage kid, you have to really balance limit setting and using natural consequences with encouraging your kids to be self-regulating. I'll see parents go to one extreme or the other, where I've seen them go the total extreme of just letting their kids do whatever they want, which can often be too enabling, or just completely trying to be the screen police and become micromanaging. And those approaches I don't see as successful as having a more balanced approach to parenting. And so limit setting is a key part. Again, it has to go, I think when kids are younger, the parental role is a more limit setting one, and when they're older, the parental role is more encouraging self-regulation and rewarding it. And so, the keys to a healthy screen balance are a lot of structure, managing those environmental cues, encouraging the development of delayed gratification and using those breaks by alternating blocks of high and low dopamine activities, using a schedule for that in many cases, and using like logical and immediate consequences, because we're understanding that, our kids' brains, they don't care about what you're going to do in 2 or 3 months. They care about what's going to happen right away. So it may be, okay, you went 5 minutes over on your high dopamine block. Maybe let's triple the 5 minutes, and now you lose 15 minutes from your next high dopamine block. That would be an example of kind of a logical and immediate consequence. And be aware of the cues and the environment that your kids are in and how they're influencing them. Have a room full of low dopamine activities, and that doesn't have any screens in it. But you could also have a room full of high dopamine activities. Like that, this is an arcade room in an amusement park. But you could have like a little arcade room in your home where you keep all the devices and screens and consoles and everything, and even the TV perhaps. And when your kid goes in that room, they're there for high dopamine activities. But when it's time to leave that room, they leave all the screens in there. I find that for a lot of parents, it's much easier to get their kids out of a room, a zone, so to speak, than it is to get the device out of the kid's hands. All right, so let's talk specifically about gaming disorder now. The World Health Organization has started to recognize it. When we're really talking about gaming addiction, but they've sort of, the scientific language has encouraged use of the words disorder and use disorder to describe what we're really when we're really mean addictive behaviors. But that's really consistent with the definition of addiction. Because addiction is when you can't when you not only can't stop using something, but it's causing problems in your life. If you just can't stop using something, that's just dependency. But when the thing that you can't stop using is causing your life to fall apart, that's an addiction. And then you can see why that's also a disorder. And that's how gaming disorder is defined. It's a pattern of gaming behavior characterized by impaired control over gaming, increasing priority given to gaming over other activities, to the extent that gaming takes precedence over these other interests. And the real key here is that it leads to negative consequences. So we're talking about significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So the definition of addiction, gaming disorder, it's very simple and straightforward. You know, it's not about the hours your kid is online. It's about, you know, what are the negative effects on their life? What are the red flags to look for? You know, seeking behaviors that might suggest that your child does have a problem with this. Are they becoming aggressive when you try to take their games away? Are they lying about their game use? Are they stealing your credit card and, you know, paying for thousands of dollars of, you know, free-to-play loot boxes online? You know, which I have many patients who have done. Are they making suicidal threats when you suggest they need to stop their games? These are just some of the many red flags that I look for, you know, when I'm concerned that someone might have gaming disorder. Now, keep in mind that gaming disorder is comorbid with a lot of other problems, as I've suggested before, things like ADHD, autism, anxiety, depression, other substances. But the reason I got into treating gaming disorder in the first place is because parents would always come to my practice and be like, you know, my kid is addicted to video games. I can see it. It's pretty obvious. But every psychiatrist or provider I go to, you know, just wants to focus on their autism, ADHD, anxiety, depression, you know, just throw meds at it or do whatever the treatment is for just those things. And they're missing the giant elephant in the room. And the truth is that you really need to get the gaming under control before you can access all those other things. And so that's really the way, you know, what my approach is. And so I'm going to take your questions and see if I can, you know, shed a little more light on this for you guys. And, you know, and I look forward to interacting with you. Here's another resource you can check out, which I was the technical editor on this book, Overcoming Internet Addiction for Dummies. It lists more resources in the community. This is what my website looks like, cliffordsussmanmd.com. And with that, I'll take your questions. So let me put my video up. All right.
You want to speak to your resource, Dr. Sussman, that you sent to me? I just dropped the link to it in the chat.
So I sent a worksheet, if you will. It's a reference to a lot of the things I talked about that would define healthy screen use. So it's really like a kind of a parent guide to what an ideal healthy screen use balance might look like. So, you know, this is sort of, so what you see would be perhaps a goal of one of my patients, you know, to have a lifestyle like what I list out on that worksheet. And, you know, kind of describes what a balance might look like. And, you know, this is something that at first might require a lot of parental regulation to reinforce, but eventually may become the way your kid can even live their life if they go off to college or do something else that's independent. And by the way, you know, if your kid really has like gaming disorder, they may not be able to just immediately go into the types of behaviors described on my worksheet. You know, they may require some kind of initial detox, like a dopamine detox, like perhaps, 3-4 days, maybe a week of abstaining from all high dopamine activities. So maybe the family goes on a camping trip or something. Or maybe you send them off to a residential center, depending on the situation. But the point is that they may need some sort of priming of their brain, some restoration of those dopamine receptors before they can really tackle living the lifestyle that's on the sheet I gave you.
Someone asked in the chat that it's very interesting, and I think so too. Someone else does too. Are there any studies to speak to the loss of sense of time? Because she has a family member that thinks they've played for an hour when it's really been 8. And my son has serious loss of sense of time.
Yes, so absolutely, there's no doubt that there's time distortion when you play video games. I mean, and that goes with the theme that I was suggesting of being in a virtual world, right? And the world has its own sense of time in it. In fact, these worlds that you're in literally have their own clock often. They have a day and night cycle, just like in the real world, but they're not in sync with the real world's day and night cycle. So, but yeah, I mean, that is, one of the things that we really try to address in treatment often is these gamers' sense of, time passing completely differently than it does in the real world. You can lose all track of real world time and not even realize that you were on for like 8 hours straight.
There's another question in the chat. Should children with ADHD have different restrictions? Well,
I mean, kids with ADHD are more vulnerable to these types of problems because they have, they all, just like teenagers in general, they have weaker breaks in their brain. They have more problems in their prefrontal cortex. So it's perhaps more important to be mindful of setting these kinds of limits and having this kind of a balance if you have kids with ADHD. And there may be many cases where, for example, you find that your kid with ADHD, can't handle being on for an hour and then stopping, but maybe they can handle being on for half an hour and then stopping. Because it tends to be with most kids that the longer they're on, the harder it is to stop. I think it's that these guidelines of healthy, balanced use are helpful for all kids. But I do think that in the case of kids with ADHD, excessive use of screens can in a way make their ADHD even worse by that process I was telling you about with downregulating dopamine receptors, in addition to a lot of other processes. So yeah, I mean, I do think you have to be more mindful of setting limits with screens with kids with ADHD. And, you may also consult a psychiatrist for additional medication management around it. But the medications used to treat ADHD, are really effective ones, the psychostimulants, what they do is they actually boost dopamine levels, right? And that's so that when you're getting external dopamine from a medication, you tend not to need as much from your environment. So it's like they're getting the stimulation from the drug, so they no longer need it from the screen. And that's why, one of the reasons kids can focus better.
I guess by listening to your presentation, I'm one of the parents that micromanage. I have a teenager who tends to put everything else on the back burner. So I decided to do a timeout on his computer and all technology in his room, especially at 9 o'clock. He has anxiety and depression and things of that nature. So at 9 o'clock, I wanted to set all computer stuff down, take a shower, take his meds, and just have his brain to stop. And he had a total meltdown. He had a total meltdown. I can't watch TV, I can't do this, and I can't do that. So how can I, and we go backwards and forwards with the arguing, how can I better help him realize that he needs to take a step back when it gets time to settle in for bed versus cutting everything off?
Well, look, I do think that in general with kids, I think a good tip for parents is that they do better. Kids with ADHD, kids with autism, kids in general do better when they know what's coming, like when they have some transition time sort of baked in. So if you give them a warning, say 5 minutes ahead of time, they may be less, it may cause less of a power struggle when you get them off. But it's even better to let them know what's going to happen if they don't get off, and to have clear consequences established ahead of time. Just because your kid has a meltdown, though, doesn't mean that you're micromanaging. It could also mean that your kid is, again, getting cut off from their dopamine supply, and not, and that can create a lot of, almost like a withdrawal, like a lot of distress and irritability. And so, so meltdowns can be caused by a lot of things. I think the reason I caution parents against micromanaging is because, some of those kids can do really well if their screen time is heavily regulated until they go off to college. And then because they've had their screen use so heavily micromanaged, it's like now all of a sudden they're a kid in a candy shop, off in college, surrounded by screens everywhere and no one to regulate them. And they might have almost become dependent on you setting the structure and the regulation for them. And so that can cause a lot of kids in college to crash and burn, just like the kids who didn't even make any effort to, whose parents didn't even make any effort to regulate their screen time during high school. So, it's really for the next stage that I for the eventual goal of independence, that I really discourage parents from, taking doing too much micromanaging or too much, just being too permissive. So I hope that answered your question. I think if you, in your specific case, there may be a lot more that could help that I'm including in here for the purpose of talking to the whole group. But I know if with things like anxiety and depression, of course, you want to be getting help for those things as well. So
thank you.
Sure.
I'll share that. We have been doing basically the same approach that Dr. Sussman has laid out, with a high dopamine time and a low dopamine time. I have a son who loves, Minecraft and those type of games, loves building, and that type of mastery activity, and the feeling that he gets from that. And so we follow up with a low dopamine activity, but he knows in the evening that it's time to not be in front of a screen. And so, like Dr. Sussman recommended, warning him multiple times in advance, not just once, multiple times, because he does have ADHD, and I could say it once or twice, even 10 times, and he is not hearing me. But he has a switch so he can get reminders that his time is almost up, and hearing me, or even using a timer that will beep at him, and so he can hear it, and then rewarding him with time to read a book or whatever it is, it's something that he enjoys. And you have to find what that is for your child, and point out after a period of time the change that you're seeing in them, because sometimes they can't see it in themselves.
I think it's important that you're also including the use of reward, not just negative consequence. Like what I'll encourage parents to do sometimes is use like a kind of a punch card, like you have at Starbucks, or you get the signatures or the whole punches in it, so that like when they're able to like stop to time their own high dopamine blocks and stop on their own and get off and transition themselves, you can still give them a reminder. maybe they get a signature on it or a hole punched. And when they have a certain amount of those signatures and hole punched, they can turn it in for perhaps a reward. So, so they're getting an immediate reward, which they can then use later. So, you know, maybe they get an actual trip to Starbucks, or maybe they get, you know, an ice cream, or get to choose where you guys go to dinner, but some reward that's not like more video game time, obviously.
I really like that idea, and I can tie it to, my kid loves to have a McDonald's at least once a week, maybe it's Friday.
Right.
So I can actually tie that to his Friday
Yeah.
meal. You know,
Mhm.
he loves after school Fridays going to Mickey D's.
Yep.
So I can tie that to that goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge for a lot of parents, like it sounds like for you as well, is to like avoid power struggles on transitions. And you know, I think there's a lot of ways to approach that. But I mean, in general, I think if you really find yourself in a power struggle with your kid when their screen time is up, you know, that's sort of a red flag, because you know, but it's you know, it's maybe saying that there needs to be more of a routine, and they have to really expect it and see it coming better. You know, more of a structured schedule. But also, you could do all that and you might still get the power struggle. And if that's the case, you know, I mean, you can always step back and look at, you know, well, can we change the blocks? Can we reassess what our plan has been? But you can also, you know, sort of in that moment, try and watch how you're responding to the power struggle, and making sure you're not getting sucked into it, and just be like, okay, you know, is it even safe for me to sit there and argue and fight with my kid over this? You know, maybe I just need to walk away, let them vent, you know, let them get it out of their systems, just make sure everyone's safe, and then come back and readdress this later. You know, I think that's important too. It's like when your kids do have a meltdown screen, is to try and not get into it with them too much, because it doesn't usually accomplish much if you are getting sucked into a power struggle. Sometimes you can just say, okay, you know, you don't want to get off your screen, fine, stay on it. You've already discussed the consequence for you staying on it. You know what's going to happen. You know, you know, you know that you're going to lose your next high dose block, so I don't have to stay there and fight with you. You get off when you want, and I'll time how long it takes you. Like, so if you tell like younger kids, sometimes older kids too, if you say to them, you know, I'm timing how long your screen block is up, and so instead of forcing you to get off, I'm just going to time how long it takes you to finish what you're doing and get off. And you know, whatever that time is, I'm going to triple that and take it off your next block. You know, you don't even have to say that, because you told it to them all ahead of time. And then, you know, you can sort of wait until they're off their dopamine high and regulated to bring it up with them, you know, and that's much safer. But they still have a consequence, you know, it's not like they're getting away with it, so to speak. So, what other questions do you have?
How would you address that? Well, you were kind of talking about it, like that aggression, like when you on teenagers, because it's harder, you know, it's almost like an adult.
That's right.
And to avoid that confrontation, and you know, as a parent, I have tried to like just say, okay, let's just do a few hours, or sometimes I just say, I'm just gonna take everything. Like video games, I'm going to take the Xbox, everything out, but I know that is not going to help either. So what will be your recommendation?
Yeah. Well, it may help temporarily if you take everything out, because like I said, sometimes kids need a good detox. Like when they're really in a place where they just can't separate from their screens, sometimes, you know, a few days off can help. I think there's easier ways to do it than to just take all their screens away. You know, but you're right, it's not a good long-term solution. But you know, I will say that like parents who've been in real challenging situations and managed to get their kids into like 3 or 4 days of detox, of high dopamine detox, have, you know, consistently had incredible results. Like, they're, oh my gosh, my teenager is acting totally different now. You know, their charm is back. They're good. They're, you know, they're actually behaving. Their personalities improved. They're actually behaving, you know, much better. So, but the problem is that's like, it's like fool's gold. It's not sustainable because they're just going to go right back into the same environment and start to binge again if you don't, like, I think that's the best opportunity to start really implementing a lot of like structure and environmental changes in the home. But yeah, I think it's, let me go back to the idea of cues too, and say that, you know, I think one of the problems is that like, usually every room in the house has like some kind of a screen in it, and the kids always taking their screen with them. And, you know, I think like it's much better for a teenager to do homework in a room that's not like filled with screens, or other low dopamine activities. And, you know, so if you can keep sort of a high and low dopamine zone in the house and keep those things separated, I think that will help. And I think a lot of teenagers are struggling the way they are now, a lot largely because during the pandemic, they were taking all their classes on a screen. So that's contributed greatly to the problem. And that was for quite a while.
They're still taking all their classes on the screen. So
Oh, that's true. That's
the
true.
problem that they're having is YouTube on the computers, and they're constantly in class looking and viewing at YouTube, when a lot of our kids who have ADHD or autism tendencies, they need to have those devices away or cut the YouTube off and only use the YouTube in class when it's appropriate with the teacher.
So as you can imagine, I'm not the biggest fan of like how heavily integrated into education screens have become. I think for a lot of the parents I work with, I'll have to sort of sometimes even advocate for them, but they may have to advocate for their kid by going to the school and saying, look, can, you know, my kid get some homework to do that's not on a screen? And, you know, or can, I mean, a lot of the times now you're even sitting in a classroom, which used to be like the one sort of safe haven from screens and a really structured place where you were getting all the right cues. You know, you had a teacher at the front of the room with a whiteboard and everybody was hopefully paying attention. Like even that sort of become infiltrated with a laptop on every desk. And, you know, and there are kids right in their classes, even when they're not at home, you know, watching YouTube videos or playing video games in the middle of class. Right on the computer that the school gave them. So, you know, a lot of this has become a pretty big like systemic problem. But yeah, I mean, I think it contributes to it. I think there's another question from Christine.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Good afternoon from my end. I'm in Ghana.
Oh, yeah. Good afternoon.
Yeah. So I really appreciate what you've taught us. And my sister has 3 kids, and here sometimes she gets so busy that we don't get a way to control the kids, so she could monitor, she could focus on her work, like she works from home. So we tend to give them tablets so they could play their favorite games and do other things. Yes, and it's been one of the best way to control them. But then realized that the second born started developing eye issues. Okay, so yeah, but it feels like the world we are today.
What are the eye issues? Like nearsightedness?
Yes, like having yes, like having tears all over her eyes every now and then, and pauses coming out. Yes, so it feels like the world we are today is very difficult to separate the kids from their tablets. So what we decided to do was that we find an interest, so like baking and other hobbies on weekends. Yes, we try to teach them baking and other things. So since it's very difficult to separate our kids or teenagers from
their screens,
the internet or the screens, yes, let's find out from them any other interests they have, just as Doc said, with the photography and other. So maybe weekend or some of the times you try to inculcate that, then they learn something So
Yeah,
that is
that's
my
right.
small way.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Thank you.
That's nice. I agree with that. And I'm not an expert on, you know, the effects on the eyes of excessive screen time, but I have read some of the data on it. And yeah, I think are we sort of out of time? Okay, that's fine. I was just gonna say that
But feel free to answer this question. Go ahead.
yeah. I mean, I could answer that over email or something, but I was just gonna say taking breaks helps, you know, from what I know.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
yeah, sure.
Dr. Sussman, if anyone has questions, are they able to reach out to you via
Yeah,
email?
they can shoot me an email. I may not always respond immediately, but I try to get to them all eventually. And you know, I may not be able to answer personal case-based questions, but you know, I'm happy to answer general questions or refer you to some extra resources for it. But the answers to a lot of questions that a lot of you may be found on my website. You know, I've got a ton of articles and videos and stuff. So, and frequently asked questions as well.
The resources that were put into the chat, will they be sent out to our email?
Tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow
Okay.
afternoon. The recording and the resources will be emailed to you tomorrow afternoon.
Thank you. This was, oh my gosh, this was so helpful and so interesting.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.